6:11 p.m. Butler, Pennsylvania. A warm July evening, thousands of people packed into an open field, waiting to hear a former president speak. Then, a sound, sharp, metallic, unmistakable, if you know what it is. Most people didn't at first. Some thought it was fireworks. Some thought it was a car backfiring. It took a full 2 seconds, maybe 3, for the crowd to understand. Those were gunshots, and they were being fired at the stage. In the span of about 8 seconds, a 20-year-old gunman fired 8 rounds from a rooftop just over 400 feet away. One bullet grazed the ear of former President Donald Trump. Another killed a man in the crowd, a husband, a father, a volunteer fire chief, who had thrown himself over his family to shield them. 2 more people were critically wounded. And then, 12 seconds after the first shot, the gunman himself was dead, shot by a Secret Service counter-sniper. In under 30 seconds, the United States came closer to the assassination of a major presidential candidate than it had in over 4 decades. What follows is not speculation, and it's not a partisan retelling. It's the timeline as established by the FBI, the U.S. Secret Service, a bipartisan congressional task force, and the Pennsylvania State Police. What is confirmed, what remains unresolved, and why a preventable failure very nearly changed the course of American history. If stories like this, grounded in the facts, not the noise, matter to you, this is a good moment to hit subscribe and turn on notifications. We're just getting started. To understand July 13th, 2024, you have to understand the days leading up to it. On July 3rd, the Trump campaign announced a rally at the Butler Farm Show grounds, roughly 40 miles north of Pittsburgh, a deliberate stop in a critical swing state, with Pennsylvania Senate candidate Dave McCormick invited to appear alongside Trump. Advance teams began setting up the grounds a week beforehand. Security planning for a former president running for office again is, by design, layered. Secret Service protection, combined with state police and local county law enforcement, filling supporting roles, particularly around the outer perimeter. In Butler, that outer perimeter included a complex of low buildings belonging to a company called American Glass Research, sitting just outside the rally's fenced security zone, separated by an open field and a chain-link fence. According to the Secret Service's own later admission, and confirmed by a congressional task force, the line of sight from the roof of that building toward the stage had been flagged as a concern in the week before the event. Discussions about it, according to one senior agent's testimony, happened all week, every day. But the AGR complex sat outside the fenced perimeter, and the plan to mitigate that risk relied on an assumption that local snipers positioned nearby would have a clear line of sight to the rooftop, and that local police would be present in the area to prevent anyone from climbing up there in the first place. That assumption did not hold. It's one of the central, confirmed findings of the investigation, and we'll return to exactly why. Separately, and importantly, the FBI has confirmed there was no specific, credible threat identified against Trump ahead of this particular rally. There had been a broader increase in his security posture in recent weeks, tied to unrelated intelligence about a possible plot linked to Iran, but nothing that pointed to the individual who would climb onto that rooftop. Meanwhile, that individual, 20-year-old Thomas Matthew Crooks, a local resident from nearby Bethel Park, had already begun his preparations, unnoticed. Here's where we draw a hard line between what investigators have established and what remains, to this day, unknown. Confirmed, Crooks was 20 years old, registered as a Republican voter, though records also showed a small past donation to a progressive political action committee. Investigators found no clear ideological through line in that mix, and they've said so publicly. Confirmed, in the weeks before the rally, Crooks conducted extensive online research, searching information about the rally, about Trump's and President Biden's public schedules, and about the anniversary of past political assassinations. He photographed the AGR rooftop from a drone days beforehand and visited the rally grounds in person more than once. The day before the shooting, he practiced at a shooting range. Confirmed, on the day of the rally, Crooks arrived early, was seen behaving suspiciously by attendees and law enforcement alike, carrying a rangefinder, moving with unusual purpose, hours before he ultimately climbed onto the roof. Multiple rallygoers tried to flag him to police in the moments before he opened fire. Some of that urgency, according to task force testimony, did not translate into action quickly enough. Confirmed, investigators recovered suspected improvised explosive devices in his vehicle in the venue parking lot and at his home, along with a remote detonator found near his body. No devices were detonated. What remains unconfirmed? A motive. Despite what officials have described as one of the most exhaustive investigations into an attack on a U.S. political figure, thousands of digital files reviewed, more than a dozen electronic devices examined, international cooperation to access foreign registered email accounts, the FBI has been direct and consistent on this point. Investigators found no evidence of coordination with any other individual or foreign entity, and Crooks acted alone. But a definitive answer to why has not been established. There is no manifesto, no confession, no single piece of evidence investigators point to as the explanation. That is an uncomfortable place to leave a story. But it is the honest one. Any account that hands you a tidy motive is going further than the official record actually goes. At 6:11 p.m., as Trump began addressing the crowd and gestured toward a chart of border-crossing statistics, Crooks opened fire from the AGR rooftop, roughly 130 yards from the stage. He fired 8 rounds from an AR-15-style rifle in the span of about 8 seconds. The first shots created chaos and confusion in a crowd of thousands who, in the first instance, didn't understand what they were hearing. Trump grabbed his ear and dropped behind the lectern. Secret Service agents moved immediately, covering him with their bodies. Almost simultaneously, roughly 4 seconds after Crooks began firing, a member of a local tactical team, positioned inside the AGR building itself rather than on its roof, fired upward and struck Crooks's rifle, which investigators believe disrupted his ability to continue firing accurately. 12 seconds after that, a U.S. Secret Service counter-sniper team fired the shot that killed Crooks. From first shot to the shooter's death, roughly 20 seconds. In that window, one bullet struck Trump's upper right ear. Another struck and killed Corey Comperatore, a 50-year-old attendee. 2 more rallygoers, David Dutch and James Copenhaver, were critically wounded. This is a moment the documentary format shouldn't rush past. Corey Comperatore was a former volunteer fire chief from Sava, Pennsylvania, a husband, a father of 2 daughters, a project engineer who spent decades serving his community as a firefighter. According to Pennsylvania Governor Josh Shapiro, who spoke directly with Comperatore's family, Comperatore threw himself over his wife and daughter as the gunfire began, shielding them with his own body. He was struck and killed instantly. His family has said the loss reshaped every day since. His sister has described the ache of gut punched constantly, his mother describing a grief that sits alongside every ordinary moment. David Dutch, 57, a Marine Corps veteran and commandant of a local Marine Corps League detachment, was shot in the chest and liver and underwent multiple surgeries. James Copenhaver, 74, was also critically wounded. Both men survived. Both, along with Comperatore's family, have since spoken publicly, not about politics, but about wanting a fuller public accounting of how the failures that led to that night happened, and whether anyone would be held responsible for them. Their frustration is a matter of public record, not editorializing. They have said, on camera, that they still want more answers than they've received. Trump was struck in the upper right ear. In the days that followed, some questioned, including, at times skeptically, whether he had truly been hit by a bullet or by shrapnel from the lectern's teleprompter glass. On July 26, 2024, the FBI issued a public statement confirming that Trump had, in fact, been struck by a bullet or bullet fragment, resolving that specific question with an official finding. After the shooting, Secret Service agents surrounded Trump at the lectern, and he was seen, in widely broadcast footage, raising his fist to the crowd before being moved off stage and into a vehicle. He was taken to a local hospital, treated, and released the same night. He appeared at the Republican National Convention in Milwaukee just days later, where he paid tribute to Comperatore on stage, displaying the firefighter's gear. This is the part of the story where the record is most detailed and most damning, not because it proves any conspiracy, but because multiple independent reviews reached strikingly similar conclusions about ordinary, preventable breakdowns. 3 separate bodies examined what went wrong: an internal Secret Service review, a Department of Homeland Security Inspector General's report, and a bipartisan congressional task force led by Pennsylvania Representative Mike Kelly. Their findings converge on several confirmed points. The perimeter was drawn in the wrong place. The AGR complex, from which crooks fired, sat outside the secure zone the Secret Service had established, separated from the rally only by a double fence line. Because it was technically outside the perimeter, it received a lower level of scrutiny than areas inside it, even though it offered a clear, elevated line of sight to the stage. The line of sight risk was known and unresolved. The task force found that law enforcement officials failed to secure the building on which the shooter had stationed himself. Concerns about that specific rooftop had been raised in advance planning meetings, but the mitigation plan rested on an assumption that local snipers and Secret Service counter-snipers already had it covered. They didn't. Not adequately. Local sniper positioning was flawed. A local tactical team had been placed inside the AGR building rather than on its roof, giving them a narrower field of view. The Secret Service's own review found that local law enforcement questioned the efficacy of that team's positioning, yet no one followed up to reconsider it, and there was no discussion with Secret Service advanced personnel about placing that team on the roof instead. Communication broke down between agencies. According to the task force report, there was no unified command post in the security room used to coordinate the event, and state and local officials said they didn't recall being invited to join it. Agents used different radio frequencies that were not suited to sharing real-time information quickly. Warnings that a suspicious individual, soon identified as crooks, had been spotted with a rangefinder and later on the roof itself, moved slowly and inconsistently between local police, state police, and the Secret Service in the critical minutes before the shooting. The Secret Service's acting director acknowledged this directly. Ronald Rowe, the agency's acting director at the time, told reporters the Secret Service deferred too much to local law enforcement on securing nearby buildings and failed to provide clear guidance, and he said the agency needed to hold itself accountable for the failures of July 13th. The task force's own conclusion was blunt. The bipartisan panel stated plainly that the evidence showed the events of July 13 were preventable. None of this proves an inside conspiracy, and no official investigation has found evidence of one. What it proves, on the record, in testimony, in the Secret Service's own internal admissions, is a chain of ordinary human and institutional failures. A perimeter drawn too narrowly, a risk flagged but not resolved, a communication system that didn't function under pressure. Institutional failure is well documented. Deliberate orchestration is not, and claims to the contrary have not been substantiated by any official inquiry. We're at the halfway point of this story. If you want more documentaries that separate verified fact from noise like this, subscribe now. And if you've got a perspective on what accountability should look like here, drop it in the comments. Just keep it respectful. There are real families in this story. Running in parallel to the security review was a separate federal investigation into Crooks himself, treated from day one as a potential act of domestic terrorism. The FBI took the lead federal role in the investigation and publicly framed it as an assassination attempt and a potential act of domestic terrorism. Over the following months, investigators reviewed more than 500,000 digital files, examined 13 electronic devices belonging to Crooks and his family, and, notably, gained international cooperation to access email accounts he'd registered in Germany and Belgium. Investigators mapped a pattern of deliberate preparation, extensive internet searches in the month before the rally, covering political events, weather, ballistics, and past assassinations, multiple visits to the rally site, a practice session at a shooting range the day before, and roughly 6 minutes spent on the rooftop immediately before he opened fire. Investigators also recovered improvised explosive devices in his vehicle and one at his home, along with evidence he'd used aliases and encrypted accounts to acquire some of his materials, details the Bureau has pointed to as evidence the attack was premeditated rather than impulsive. And yet, on the central question of motive, the FBI's public position hasn't moved. Investigators have said the probe indicated Crooks acted alone, that no motive has been identified, and that the investigation gathered extensive evidence while remaining open to new information. Officials have acknowledged crooks had posted violent, anti-government content online years before the attack, but they've said those posts didn't meet the legal threshold for an investigation at the time, and no tip about him was ever submitted to authorities. It's worth naming plainly. Online speculation about a hidden motive, a second shooter, or a broader plot has circulated widely since July 2024. None of it has been substantiated by the FBI, the Secret Service, or the Congressional Task Force. This documentary isn't going to manufacture certainty the official record doesn't have. The honest answer, as of the most recent public findings, is that investigators know an enormous amount about what Crooks did and how he did it, and very little about why. In the aftermath, the Secret Service publicly committed to a series of reforms, and independent oversight bodies have continued to track whether those changes were implemented. Confirmed changes and commitments include an increase in Trump's protective detail to a level the agency has described as more robust than any former president has previously received. Leadership acknowledgement of the specific breakdowns in perimeter planning and interagency communication, and a stated commitment to establishing clearer protocols for shared command posts and radio interoperability between the Secret Service and local law enforcement partners at future events. The task force's final report, released in December 2024, went further, recommending that Secret Service site agents be required to formally identify every potential sniper line of sight to a protectee in advance of an event, document how each one will be mitigated, and obtain supervisor sign-off on that mitigation plan before the event takes place. That recommendation was made in direct response to what happened in Butler, where line-of-sight concerns were discussed but never formally closed out. It's important to be precise here. These are the confirmed findings, admissions, and recommendations on the public record as of the most recent reporting. Broader questions about individual accountability, discipline, or resignations within the Secret Service remain, in the words of the victims' own families, incompletely answered more than a year on. Whatever else is unresolved about July 13, 2024, its impact on American political life is not in dispute. It was the closest a major party presidential candidate had come to assassination in decades, and it happened in full public view, captured from dozens of angles by rally attendees' phones within seconds. It reshaped the security posture around every major candidate for the remainder of the 2024 campaign, prompted the most detailed bipartisan congressional review of protective operations in a generation, and forced a public reckoning inside the Secret Service itself about complacency, communication, and the assumptions agencies make about someone else covering a given risk. It also became, almost immediately, a flashpoint in the broader national conversation about political violence, condemned across the political spectrum in the hours afterward, even as, in the months since, it has also become fertile ground for competing narratives and unverified claims. That gap, between a well-documented, thoroughly investigated failure of planning and the speculation that has grown up around it, is itself part of the story of how the country processed this event.